Hello and welcome to the Flourishing Introvert Talks with me, Jo Rawbone. This is the podcast that celebrates the natural gifts of introverts so that we can flourish in all situations. Episode 263, Navigating Emotions at Work. I'm starting this episode with a couple of questions that have been buzzing around my head for a few weeks now. Is it okay for you to emote at work? How safe do you feel to be tearful or angry or exuberant? Of course, the reality is that we are continually sharing and showing our emotions. It's almost impossible not to. But it seems that some managers and leaders are incapable of allowing us our feelings. So, in this episode, I'll be exploring the challenges associated with emoting at work, why engaging our emotional intelligence is essential, and the high cost of suppressing our emotions. So buckle up, as I'll be getting a little bit vulnerable, a bit snarky, and I'm not taking prisoners. What an interesting combination. Not long ago, I wrote a LinkedIn article about a billionaire industry mogul who told people to keep their whole self at home. He said that in the workplace, people need to act like a professional and a grown-up. I still stand behind every word of that article, and you'll still find it on LinkedIn if you're curious. His behaviour would have sent a very clear message to me had I been in his employ, and the message is that he can only deal with the narrowest range of emotions, and probably those that he feels comfortable with or able to handle in some way. And, I imagine, those emotions that support his stance and don't require him to show any empathy. God forbid he show his humanity. I believe that an inability of this type, an inability to allow people to be their whole self at work, stems from a place of insecurity and a fear of their own emotions. Both of these therefore point to low emotional intelligence. But who's going to be the one to give that billionaire this feedback? I do wonder when an executive order will be signed forbidding emotional exchanges in the workplace. Well, for the likes of you and I, anyway. And given what we've seen, I wonder what will be considered acceptable and by extension unacceptable. Well, we've recently been shown a display of that, haven't we? And judging by what has been shown to us, anger from some people is clearly acceptable. Cussing about people wanting to sign a petition is clearly acceptable. Hostility directed at a weary underdog is clearly acceptable. Superiority seems acceptable to those who make the rules. Cunning and deception are okay if you're the leader. Smugness is an acceptable parting shot. Where are we? On the set of The Stepford Wives or in the middle of The Handmaid's Tale? As someone on social media posted recently, Orwell's 1984 was a warning, not an instruction manual. Feeling and expressing our natural and true emotions are what sets us apart from many other species, and anyone who tries to stifle you from emoting is trying to stifle your experience of being human. In my opinion, it's a form of coercive control, and we need to resist that at every turn. More than that, though, I've literally just read an article reminding me that suppressing our feelings builds up an emotional debt which costs us way more than we may think. And as with any debt, the compound interest on unprocessed emotions builds daily. Rather than these emotions simply going away on their own, which is what many of us probably hope, they are stored in our physical body and our psychological memory. So at best, they store up frustration, and at worst, they trigger cortisol and other stress hormones, resulting in well-known damage to our bodies. So we have a bit of a tightrope to walk. Don't suppress, but don't projectile vomit our emotions either. In my experience, that tightrope walk needs practice with a balance beam for sure. When we learn to really tune into and understand our emotions, we're developing as we're meant to. But here's the thing about that from a well-developed adult's perspective. We each have a responsibility to regulate our emotions and express them appropriately. Positions of power do not give anyone the right to vomit emotionally over their subjects, followers, or employees. So, if we're being encouraged to believe that for we little people to be successful, we need to deny and contain our emotions unnaturally, we're being led down a dangerous path. And let's face it, we introverts have more than enough to contend with, navigating toxic politics, unconscious bias, and the resultant inequity in the workplace. So this leaves me with the question, how do we introverts manage our emotions professionally in these volatile times when we're in the workplace? All I feel I can do is share my perspective, and if it works for you, brilliant. If it doesn't, use my thoughts as a catalyst to find your own approach, but don't just hold your feelings in thinking they don't deserve expressing. You see, the current outrage I have felt has stirred something in me. It's moved me to find and use my voice in ways that I might have considered too scary before. And as I do so, I'm really clear that I am voicing my opinions with the associated emotions. I'm not claiming that I am right and people must listen or be expunged. And I know many others have been similarly moved and as a result are finding their voice. This is how we approach a tipping point. To do this responsibly, the place for me to start is to engage my emotional intelligence. This means I need to connect with whatever I'm feeling in order to feel it deeply. I spent far too many years denying my feelings for fear of upsetting people. Eventually, I realised that if someone gets upset, it's their business. And equally, if I get upset, as I have done recently, that's my business. And as a responsible adult, I need to take care of it. I've spoken many times before about my years in the emotional wilderness, feeling like a head on a stick, disconnected from my emotions. So it's taken years of work on my part to own and feel my feelings. I do agree that there is a need to contain inappropriate emotional outbursts when in a professional setting. So I find it interesting that it's acceptable for business and global leaders not to contain their emotional outbursts. Like the head of an investment bank who swore angrily about those of us who are more productive working from home. I imagine if you or I had sworn angrily back at him, we'd have been served our marching orders. So, sadly, how we emote is not a question of do as I do. More often than not, it's do as I say. My journey to authentic emoting in the workplace has been an interesting one. It started out with me being pretty open and able to be myself emotionally. Then I got criticised once too often for being overly emotional. I was a female engineer in an all-male environment after all. But it was okay for me to swear like a navvy, so I did, and that satisfied my need for emotional release. Once I moved into the echelons of middle management, swearing seemed to be a privilege that came with rank. I had huge respect for Jack, one of my more senior managers, who had the reputation of calling a spade an effing shovel. But he didn't aim his foul language at people. It was usually about a situation, and that makes a huge difference. When we aim our emotions at people, it becomes a power play, veering towards bullying in an attempt to exert dominance. As someone very wisely advised me, for those of us more used to being in the background, contributing less frequently, it's not about dominance, it's about prominence. I've acted from that advice ever since. My parents brought me up to believe that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. That's a very old-fashioned way of thinking, and not one that I'd necessarily condone these days, as some names are deliberately aimed with vicious intent. It does, however, come back to control and influence. I have little, and in some cases no, control over who was saying what. But as Viktor Frankl reminded us, I can control the way I respond. It seems I'm to share Frankl's quote at least once every season, and I'm happy to do that because I wish it was something more leaders would learn from. He said between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Wise words indeed. My parents' mantra taught me resilience and that I could take a pause and decide how I respond. They taught me that name-calling was often the tactic of the scared, sometimes powerless bully. The older and wiser I got, the more I realised that I always had a choice in the moment, to take the name to heart as though it were the truth, or allow it to bounce off my protective bubble of self-worth. If I react and engage, I'm caught in the psychological game, a game in which there is only one winner. If I refuse to play their game, I don't lose. And yes, there's a difference between winning and not losing. I rarely need to win, but there are times where I need to make sure I don't lose. What I have observed over time is that if I can stay cool, observe the pause, control how I respond, I rarely regret my words or actions. Recently, I allowed my emotions to spill over, which caught me by surprise and impacted others negatively. The ripples of my spillage are still rebounding, and I've become acutely aware of how, or indeed how much, I share when I am both tired and emotional. So I still have work to do. I took my recent overspill situation to supervision, and as a result of that exploration, here are my refined strategies about how and when to emote. Number 1, notice my emotion. Feel into it and use the pause to start to explore the root. If I'm in an interaction, I need to decide calmly how to respond in the moment. If you think you lack emotional literacy, as I did for many years, try using Brené Brown's freely available Atlas of the Heart resource or Dr. Gloria Wilcox's Feelings Wheel. Both of these resources helped me develop my understanding of my emotions. Number 2, own my emotion. If I choose to share my feelings, my emotions, I make it clear that I am feeling it and owning it. None of this "you make me feel" nonsense, as we are the ones who decide how we feel. That can be a tough lesson to learn. From the assertive stable, it's more appropriate to express our emotions in the form of, "When that happened, I felt this." I'm not blaming or trying to shame anyone. I'm owning my feelings. Number 3, inquire how others feel. This is not to get approval or even recognition of how I'm feeling, but to enable others to express their own emotions in a safe space. Younger generations are more used to talking about their emotions as they've been taught about emotional intelligence through the social and emotional aspects of learning. We older generations have some catching up to do. Number 4, clear up any mess. If I have projectile vomited my emotions or allowed them to spill over inappropriately, it's mine to clear up. I still have some clearing up of my own to do following my recent overspill, as I can still detect more than a faint whiff of my spilled emotions on those who were impacted. And as I'm mopping up and cleaning down, I need to ensure that I'm not just ingesting or storing those emotions again, but finding the best way to process them and then wash them away. Which brings me to my final point. Number 5, reflect to understand. Take time out to discern whether the feeling is mine to feel or if it's something in the field. I find a Gestalt perspective is really useful here, and I explore whether the feeling is really mine to feel or maybe it was an introject from the wider field. This becomes clearer as I sit with the emotion. So there you have my refined process, figured out with the help of my supervisor. Please feel free to take any of it that works for you, as long as you do have a process and make it your own. Emotional contagion is real, so we need to be mindful of what we are spreading. Mirror neurons enable us to have shared emotional experiences, but we may not understand them if they weren't ours in the first place. Of course, contagion of positive emotions is a joyful experience and one that I'd say we need more of. It's why I smile and nod an acknowledgement to strangers, yes, even as an introvert, and I tell people if I love their hair or their shoes or their smile. I am an introvert, not a socially anxious misanthrope. Just like during any contagious outbreak, we need to know when to mask or gown up or wear a symbolic hazmat suit in a genuine attempt to prevent the spread of unhealthy emotions. And I strongly suggest washing ourselves clean of the negative emotions we've been exposed to. And we've had a lot of exposure recently. Failure to do so allows that emotional debt to build, which negatively impacts our health, relationships, and productivity, both individually and collectively. So notice rather than negate your emotions. Process rather than push aside. Express rather than suppress. And with the support of a buddy, coach, mentor, or supervisor, build your emotional literacy in order to navigate this difficult terrain. That's the equivalent of practicing your tightrope walk with a balance beam. The more of us who behave with an advanced level of emotional intelligence and emotional maturity, the more we can advocate for one another, meaning the faster a valuable tipping point will be reached. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, then please subscribe, rate us and leave a comment, because we know that helps other people find the podcast. And if other people find us, other introverts can flourish.
You are listening to an Intentional Media Production podcast.